Okay, for anybody that's trying to understand magnetism, you have to understand what field incommensurability is and how the two fields within a magnet express themselves. Now, first we have to, of course, define what a magnet is. Now, prior to a magnet being created inside of a magnetizing coil, we have obviously no empirical difference in the quantification of the magnet prior to its being magnetized than after it has been created into a very powerful magnet. So what has changed? Obviously not one iota of the quantity of a magnet has changed. What has happened is the qualitative change in the magnet. Now that change is field coherency. Now if you don't understand this, you're never going to understand my book on magnetism, and you may not want to, but if you're watching this video, I assume you do want to. You then have to ask yourself, well, what is the difference between a 5-watt light bulb that is absolutely worthless to read by and a 5-watt laser that will burn a hole right in your ass? And the answer is coherency. Okay? Coherency of the expression of electromagnetic fields, or in this case, we have coherency of the expression of the reciprocating hyperboloid that has been made coherent through a dielectric force capacitance increase and a causation of the qualitative change of the now created magnet such that there is field coherency. Now here we must imagine a cylinder magnet. Now, this could be equally a spherical magnet or a cube magnet, doesn't make any difference. Let's separate out the two fields. Now here's the magnet right here. If we imagine a rectangular box around this, this is the hyperboloidal expression of the two fields that are always fighting each other. Now, a coherent field that exists either at the atomic scale or coherently at the macro scale, and the magnet must always express itself out this way. Now, the only thing that's missing in this diagram right here is gyromagnetic precession, which we know is the Lamour frequency. A magnet is a reciprocating precessional hyperboloid which extrapolates itself out in a hypertoroidal fashion. It is absolute simplex field dynamics that is ultimately and irreducibly no more complex than fluid dynamics. Even a brain-dead plumber knows that water flows downhill, and he bases his entire plumbing skills off the notion of fluid dynamics. Okay, plumber looks at your plumbing and goes, "Your pipes ain't running downhill. That's why your toilet ain't draining." Um, while people think that my book or my explanation of magnetism, which is irrefutable by the way, is complex, I say, well, you say stuff like reciprocating precessional hyperboloid, and well, that's a word salad. It is really divinely simplex. I assure you that once you have the geometry of this precessional nature of magnetism within your head, and you visualize it, you will see that it is as simple as a silver pool of light. I mean, it is divinely simplex beyond comprehension. It is not complex. Now let's separate out the two field expressions within a magnet. Here we have the entire magnet in the metal, okay, expressing out field incommensurability. Now field incommensurability inside the polarized magnet, i.e. the neodymium boron lump or the ferrite of the samarium cobalt that's been turned into a magnet, or this also exists at the atomic scale within the hydrogen atom, expresses itself out as a hyperboloid, okay? If you don't know what a hyperboloid is, then look it up. Now let's just take a look at the magnetic field. Here you have a point of near infinite zero, close to zero magnetic field at the center of the magnet. All we've done is remove the walls of the magnet. We have increasing magnetic flux density, increasing at the point of centrifugal divergence out of either side or quote-unquote pole of a magnet. Now let's look at the other field that is that exists inside the magnet. That's the dielectric field. It is absolutely inverse to the magnetic. Okay, wherever magnetism is present, there is decreasing dielectricity. Wherever there is increasing dielectricity, there is increasing magnetism. And you can see all this underneath ferrofilm or magnetic viewing film. Very simple. You can see the dielectric inertial plane of any magnet. We have increasing max dielectric inertial plane. While this shows large spatially, what it actually shows is maximum flux density of dielectric non-Euclidean convergence. This would be the counterspatial point of the erasure of a force in motion, i.e. maximum acceleration is zero acceleration. Same reason why at the center of the Earth there is no gravity, or at the center of the Sun there is no gravity. the absolute epicenter of any field, you will find that there is not that field. At the point of maximum, at the middle of any magnet, you will find that there is no magnetism. And obviously at the point of maximum space, you'll find no counter space. You'll actually find the creation of space. There is no such thing as a field terminating in space, or space acting on things or doing things. Space is literally nothing other than the lack of inertia. Now, space is created as the posterior attribute of a divergent field. As Tesla said, a field has never terminated in space. Space has never been a terminal, an output, or an input for any field, be it gravity, electricity, magnetism, or dielectricity. Space is nothing other than the posterior privation of inertia, which is lost. So here we have the magnetic field, and here we have the dielectric field. Now let's take a look at what us pathetic little human critters talk about when we think of magnetic attraction and repulsion. Down here we have repulsion, quote unquote. Up here we have magnetic attraction. Now, if you look at these on their side, and you actually tilt them upwards, you'll see the hyperboloid right here. This is the point of counterspatial erasure. This is increasing inertia and acceleration, and decreasing force and motion. What exists between these two is space, but space is not a thing. It is a privation of a thing, okay? And a privation is not a thing in itself. Someone could say, well, I'm cold when I sit in the shadow of a tree, therefore a shadow is something, because when I sit in the shadow, there is no sun, therefore a shadow is something that acts on me. It makes me cold. But this is one of the great stupidities of human understanding, because humans aren't evolved enough yet intellectually to understand that a privation is not something in itself which can do things. Now we could say that ghosts exist, and well, let's just say dragons exist, and we tell our children stories about dragons or whatever, and someone says, oh, a dragon's coming, and someone could get afraid and have a heart attack, and that someone could say, well, a dragon killed that person. But it doesn't exist. I mean, we're talking about something that is a privation, a figment, a concept that does something. Space is the very same thing. What we have here is the erasure of the lack of inertia between these two magnets, where we have opposite poles. Now, a magnet ultimately does not have poles, but that's a point for another discussion. Well, a magnet doesn't have poles. It has the inverse of counter space. Inverse of counter space is obviously volume. Volume is measured in a collection of atoms which are expressing themselves coherently because they have field coherency, or what we term as a magnet. We talk about aligned domains. Remember, a magnet is nothing other than speaking about the coherency of the atomic field structure within the magnetized magnet. So here we have increasing acceleration and decreasing force and motion, which is contrary to our lowbrow human collective understanding that if we accelerate, we're increasing motion. But as the case of fields, what we have in increasing acceleration, we have decreasing force and motion. Now, what we have here below, humans, incorrectly understand is magnetic repulsion. You take two like poles, you push them together, you feel this force. Well, in this case, it's the truth. You actually have increasing force. So the more you try to squeeze them together, the more force you have. What you also have is increasing motion. You think, well, that doesn't make any sense. As I'm pushing these together, they come together slower and slower and slower. But what's happening is you have increasing motion and force occurring at the counterpoint between the two magnets that are being pushed or forced together. As they're being forced together, that force is amplifying exponentially between them. So actually, while there's nothing in between them and they are slowing down as you're pushing them together, you do have, as per field theory, increasing motion. Now this is increasing force and deceleration. Well, how can we have increasing motion and also deceleration? Well, it's very simple. Up here we have the hyperboloid. Down here we have the sphere. You have an expanding sphere of force and motion as these are trying to be pushed together or forced together by whatever means. Now here we have the hyperboloid. Here we have the sphere. I don't know how much you know about Euclidean geometry or non-Euclidean counterspatial geometry, but the inverse of a sphere is, now this is a mathematical fact. This isn't my hypothesis. This is a hardcore fact. The inverse, the total opposite of a sphere is a hyperboloid. In other words, if you were to mathematically invert, which has been done by the way, if you mathematically invert a sphere, what you end up with is a hyperboloid. Now if you look at this on its side, standing upright instead of on its side, you will see this. This is the hyperboloid right here. Here we have the magnetic field and a magnet. Here we have the dielectric field and a magnet. Here we have the sphere. Here we have the hyperboloid. Now the sphere is occurring at the counterpoint of decreasing magnetic force and motion. Here we have increasing acceleration and inertia. We have a null point where no magnetic force exists. And as I've told you before, there is no such thing as gravity as an autonomous force. Gravity and magnetism and electricity and dielectricity are all one and the same things. It is absolutely as absurd to speak of them as autonomous entities or principles of cosmic dynamics as it is to speak of water as one thing and steam as another and ice as another thing. It's ludicrous. They're all water. So Mother Nature is not an insane crack whore with a bag of magic particles and quantum ghosts and all this other crap, okay, as one would be believed if one were very stupid and delusional by quantum mechanics and Einsteinian physics, because all of this is a brain fart that is doomed to oblivion. Even modern quantum mechanics knows that the ether must exist. However, the ether is as insane a word in quantum mechanics as it is to yell out Satan in the middle of a church recital. But what they've done is they've replaced it with another word, and that word is quantum fluid. So all the quantum mechanics has done is replace the evil word of the ether with something that's exactly the same thing, and they're starting to call it quantum fluid. Most people don't know that magnetism was never understood exactly how a magnet works, and since everybody knows that fields are not particles and everything is fields, how do we extrapolate out particle-free action at a distance, especially instantaneous action at a distance, such as gravitation, such as magnetic acceleration or deceleration, gravitational acceleration? How do we explain that, since fields are not particles? And of course, according to physics and quantum physics, everything is particles, but Mother Nature is not a crack whore. The cosmos doesn't work based upon Einstein and quantum mechanics. This is all an absurdity. They can never explain what a field is. There is no denotation of a field in any branch of particle physics or quantum mechanics, because fields are not particles, but everything is fields. Now we have mathematical formulas out the wazoo for Fluxion density and effects upon a moving semiconductor and electromagnetic retardation, and all sorts of formulas for calculating out the empirical effects upon other things. There is not one single explanation in the entire Earth that exists of what a field is, because humans are not evolved yet enough to know what a field is. But a field is extremely simple. A field is inertia, and space is nothing. Space is the absence of inertia. Extrapolating out what a field is and how they're all connected is extremely simple. But humans don't want simple explanations. They want to believe that what they're taught in school and what Einstein taught and quantum mechanics teaches is true, but it has no basis in reality. All of quantum mechanics is based upon the notion that magnetism is mediated out by these things called virtual photons, excuse me. There's absolutely no empirical evidence for virtual photons. It's as absurd to say virtual photons as it is to say mystical microscopic unicorns. To say, well, how does a magnet work? Oh, microscopic unicorns. Someone would say, well, that's patently absurd, but the explanation from quantum mechanics and current physics is absolutely no different in its absurdity. Virtual particles both don't exist, and they're absolutely a conceptual invention of quantum mechanics that has no basis in reality. They've never been seen, measured, experimented, never been the outputs of any results or the inputs of any testing. They don't exist. They have no basis in reality, yet all of quantum mechanics is based upon virtual particles. And they themselves admit that there's absolutely no basis whatsoever for the existence of this nonsense. So, you have to start questioning humanity when it starts putting faith and credence in these pathetic little heretics. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll catch you later.
So far, what we've considered are waves that move along, and as they do, they transfer energy. And because they're transferring energy, we can say that these waves are progressive as they progress along. But what I'd like to look at now are another type of wave, and this kind of wave, it doesn't transfer energy, but it stores it. And what we're going to look at instead are waves that don't seem to move at all, and these are called standing or stationary waves. So it's these standing or stationary waves where we store energy, and they're quite different to the progressive waves that you've been used to so far. So how are these waves formed? Well, if we have a progressive wave that is moving along and it reflects off some kind of boundary or perhaps an endpoint, the reflected wave will come back, and this time the reflected wave will have the same kind of amplitude and phase difference, and it's the interaction of these two waves where we look at superposition and the overall resultant that gives us a standing wave. What I'm going to look at here is a series of standing waves that we can have set up perhaps on a string, and provided we have a fixed end at both sides, the wave that we set up can't move up and down at the end because it's in a fixed position. And what I have here is the first standing wave that we produce, and what we have is at the end it can't move, and this is what we call a node, or effectively there's no displacement at the node. We also have a point of maximum displacement, which is an opposite to a node, and this is what we call an antinode. And all I've drawn in here is effectively the maximum and the minimum position of perhaps a string which is vibrating. I can repeat it for perhaps the second kind of standing wave that we can fit in. So again, we're going to have the ends must be constrained, but this time there's another wave that is actually the length of one complete wavelength. And if I draw that as one of its waveforms, the opposite to this at the other extreme, half a cycle later, looks a bit like this. And again, we have a node at each end. We also have a node, or a point of no displacement in the middle, and then we have an antinode and another antinode. Now the key thing about this is that because this is one wavelength, the distance from a node to another antinode is equal to the wavelength of that wave over 2. In this one here, this is also equal to the wavelength over 2, and so on. And if we repeat the process, what we have here, although they're slightly dodgily drawn, we do have various other standing waves that can be set up within the same distance. From the diagram so far, they all look a bit static, so this is what it would look like. Here we have a couple of nodes and the particles moving up and down in the middle, and then we also have another wave that has 3 nodes and also one that has 4. Looking in a bit more detail at these various diagrams here, perhaps we have a string that has length L. And what we have here is the first standing wave that we can produce. What we call this is the fundamental. For this fundamental, because the length is equal to the wavelength over 2, we can say that the wavelength is equal to 2L. And this happens at a certain frequency, which we call F0 or F0. And that is the fundamental frequency of that standing wave. Now there's another one here. This time, what we call this is the second harmonic. The reason being that the fundamental frequency is the first harmonic, and the second harmonic, the wavelength is equal to the length of that string, and we call this, where it basically has twice the frequency of the first one. And what we then have is the third and the fourth. And what we find with many musical instruments is that because we have all these harmonics, we have various multiples of that fundamental frequency. So what we find is that there are a number of modes of vibration, various harmonics, and we still have the nodes and antinodes, and as we have a higher and higher frequency, we can see the wavelength gets smaller and smaller.
The illusion of motion deceives everyone, so that the profound laws have been written by scientists which don't have the slightest foundation of truth in them, much less the very fundamental laws that I could see behind the scenes. When I came back, I bought textbooks to find out the names of that which I knew in space, in the universe, in another way as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 4, 3, 2, 1, and back to 0. That is all I needed to know. And the names of those 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. are in textbooks: lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, one series of elements after another. But to me they were always 1, 2, 3, 4, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 in everything. Whether that was the octave spectrum of color or the octave on the piano, every expression of motion is in the octave wave, and I knew the wave. And in the wave is the secret of creation, and I had that. I knew it in a timeless flash.
Holographic self-similarity follows in the magnetic model, but what magnetism is most definitely what people do not understand. As was said long ago by Faraday, magnetism is the dielectric field. Dielectricity is the inertia. The loss of that inertia manifests itself in a geometric form pattern, but that form pattern is not three-dimensional. It is resultantly and demonstrably so three-dimensional in that it has volume, but magnetism itself is two-dimensional. It is only resultantly three-dimensional and contains and creates volume. It is not voluminous, but it is by definition that which creates volume by nature of the mass which it must transverse. Here we can actually see the hypertoroidal pattern that you actually find underneath the ferrocell, as evidenced here from one of my videos, and here, as you can see 1,000 times over, the quote-unquote spirograph-like pattern that forms the construct. What these are constructive and destructive interferences, as commonly found in the double slit experiment, but unfortunately, modern science being the bullshit that it is, slit experiment, but unfortunately, modern science being the bullshit that it is, it thinks that light is both particle and wave, but it is neither particle nor is it a wave. A wave is not a thing, rather what something does. And certainly so, there's no such thing as a photon. That is misunderstanding the coaxial nature of light, which a longitudinal pulse perturbation with resultant transverse electrical magnetic components, necessitatively so, resultant to its propagation. But the propagation is in the field itself. Nothing is propagating in the sense of an object moving from point A to point B, but these are constructive and destructive interferences of the resultant divergent centrifugal magnetism interacting with the increasing inertia and acceleration of the centrifugal. But the centrifugal is not magnetism per se, not specifically denotatively, but we can say that it is so superficially so. This is the confusion of the misunderstanding by everybody in the world as to the conjugate nature and the relationship of magnetism to dielectricity. We can't say that the head side of a coin is something completely different than the tail side of the coin. Obviously, they both entail the coin. Or actually, specifically would be the case, the head and the tail would be the magnetism, but the silver of which the coin is made would be the dielectricity. You certainly do not have the magnetism without the dielectricity, or the dielectric silver, as if we were in that analogy. Let's take a look at the central toroid. We'll actually see here a two-dimensional model. Here we have a three-dimensional representation. This conjugate geometry, if we actually take the inverse of the toroid, we have the hourglass pattern of the hyperboloid, which forms the conjugate nature with the toroidal, the creation of not space and volume itself, but magnetism and space and volume are synonymous. The loss of that inertia as manifest three-dimensionally only results into the necessary mass which it must transverse, and which resultantly is the therefore arise of phase, and is therefore the rise resultantly of voluminous gyromagnetic precession. We actually have to understand two-dimensional geometry. We have to understand what the hypertrochoidal is. We also have to understand what gyromagnetic precession is. We can actually do, or you could do specifically, a lookup on what gyromagnetic precession is, and specifically two-dimensional Poincaré disk model of projective geometry, which necessitatively spells out the nature of a two-dimensional model as projected in three-dimensional geometry. Now let's actually show that with a really simple program here. Here you can actually see the pattern of the ferrocell on this simple two-dimensional pattern, which will draw out in 360 degrees a circle. Well, you don't see a circle here, you see a top-down view of the torus. Well, you don't see a circle here, you see a top-down view of the torus, obviously so. And here we have it underneath the ferrocell of constructive and destructive interference. And of course we have the black spot where no constructive or destructive interference is occurring. We have the top part of the hyperboloid, or the top of the hourglass if you were, showing the field geometry of increasing inertia and acceleration, i.e. the dielectric. The two of these together are the conjugate, which define one another. The dielectric defines the magnetic, and the magnetic defines the field geometry of the dielectric. So let's erase this and start over, and here's where we'll have to understand, and you'll have to research what it is the Poincaré disk model of projective geometry. And all I'm going to do, I needed to find the center to do this, all I'm going to do is draw a circle as best I can. Only a circle, but it will be manifest in replication in 360 degrees opposite to where I'm drawing it, and also 90 degrees and 45 degrees and so on. I think with 18 manifestations, but all I'm doing is drawing a simple circle. But here we have, and let's do it again, except try to be more perfect since I'm doing this by hand. Here we have the hypertrochoidal pattern, which shows the magnetic circle. The only way the loss of inertia manifests itself is the manifestation of a circle. It's a two-dimensional circle. But magnetism is three-dimensional, or is the creation of three-dimensional space. But this is necessitatively only due and resultant to the mass that it is three-dimensional. Magnetism itself, if we were to take a point of inertia, which is certainly so a nonsensical term since there is no point, inertia itself is non-Cartesian. It is by definition counter space in the true definition of what energy is. But if we were to take a single point and apply the loss of that inertia, which follows 1 over 5 to the power of -3, we will see what we have is actually just a two-dimensional circle, where the loss of pure potential is Cartesianally manifest in a circle and replicated here in fullness. You'll actually see we actually have what appears to be a three-dimensional top-down torus. And this, of course, is what we see in the ferrocell. Magnetism is two-dimensional. Inertia, the loss of that inertia, and this, of course, is perfectly in line with the holographic model of the nature of the universe. Magnetism is only three-dimensional, resulting to the nature of the mass, by which it must, if coherent, reciprocate itself to termination. Really, it is an expanding circle. Nothing is moving like my cursor is currently. moving outwards as you see my cursor is moving, we actually have, technically, I could draw this same two-dimensional geometry by showing an increasing circle going from an infinitesimally small point, will actually be a counterpoint in counter space, to a larger and larger and larger and larger and larger circle. So that would actually be, according to the geometry of the nature of magnetism, the way in which I would, quote, draw the loss of inertia would be an increasing circle instead of a point moving out and then moving back again. Instead of a point moving out and then moving back again, kind of like a comet going around the sun, it would just be an increasing circle and then a decreasing one. Upon termination, nothing is emitted by the loss of that inertia from counter space, but saying from implies our Cartesian coordinate, but counter space has no point by which we may define from. So we would actually have to imagine this as an expanding circle and then a contracting one, and then apply our understanding of geomagnetic precession, because the loss of inertia and polarity is only denotatively the inverse of counter space. There's obviously no such thing as a monopole, but polarity two-dimensionally is not a north pole and a south pole. A magnet doesn't have poles, it has the inverse of counter space. The loss of that inertia is manifest, obviously so, three-dimensionally, resultant to the mass of which it is present therein, i.e. the coherent magnetic field. So we not only have the divergence and the phase, but we have the geomagnetic precession, which draws out, if you will, for lack of a better term, this toroidal, because the inverse image of this torus is the hyperboloid, the hourglass that is the negative image of a torus. The inverse of an hourglass is a torus, and the inverse of a torus is the hyperboloid. These form the geometry of force and motion, and the inverse geometry to that, inertia and acceleration. Everything begins with inertia and acceleration, within which we actually have a rate of decay of loss of inertia, which therefore manifests itself resultantly as the hypertrochoidal two-dimensional, or the magnetic field. But magnetism is not something different from dielectricity. Magnetism is just the manifestation of dielectricity. I kind of drew that really crooked. Magnetism is the manifestation of dielectricity as resultant to the loss of its energy, which is counter space, is pure potential, is pure energy, pure non-Cartesian actuality. This is true power is rest, not manifestation of power. One might think ignorantly, as any human being would, that power would be an atomic bomb going off, for example. Well, that's true power. True power, one might think. But obviously it's just the inverse of that, magnetism being analogous to the explosion itself, but that is impotency. The release of that power, the release of that energy is force and motion. It is the absolute loss of true power. True power would be that 3-pound lump of plutonium that sits in your hand like an innocent baseball. I mean, that is true power. That is about the closest analogy I could draw. I kind of drew that crooked there. It's hard to draw a perfect circle freehand like this on a computer screen to get the hypertrochoidal pattern, but I think you get it now. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, just click the link below. Anything to expand your mind. But this is the secret of Mother Nature, the conjugate nature of magnetism and dielectricity. Both are inextricably connected at the very core. One, magnetism is not something different than dielectricity. Magnetism would what we'd be calling, what we would denotatively and ignorantly call force, but it's not force. It is simply the loss of inertia that we understand to be dielectricity, or the counterspatial pure energy of the nature of the universe. Its manifestation being force and motion. We therefore call it something else, even though it is not something else. We call it magnetism, but there is not an autonomous field modality known as magnetism. It is simply an expression of the loss of the potential of dielectricity, which must only and necessitatively form the geometry which we call magnetism, which is the creation of space and volume and force and motion. All of these are one and the same thing. That's the power as manifest, but not the power in true, which is completely unmanifest, necessitatively and logically so.